So originally this was going to be a blog post, but I was having a lot of trouble formulating my thoughts in like an organized way, so I'm just going to sort of free form. I've got some bullet points. I'm going to attempt to describe this sort of political, I don't know, you could call it a manifesto. I don't think it really is though. Just off the top of my head. It's taken me like 3 days. Okay, I'm going to skip the introduction and get right into it. You've seen the title of this video, The Case for Depravity and the Need for Diversified Societies. So let's start with the former, with the case for depravity. So every revolution is at heart a revolution of the degenerates against the moral high castle. Okay? So what I mean by that is, if you look at the liberal revolution, from feudalism into liberalism, or whatever, right? Not only was the idea of a society ruled by bourgeois merchants seen as bad by the hereditary aristocracy because it was a threat to their power, but it was also seen as bad because it was sort of morally abhorrent. You can read a lot of ancient texts, or not that ancient, but texts from before we had liberal democracy, you know, and this idea of democracy or rule by merchants, any of these sorts of things, is considered to be sort of icky, sort of like a gross, disgusting idea, a depraved idea almost. And you see this time and time again. Every form of oppression is predicated on this aversion to a perceived depravity. You could see it in racism, you know. The idea of black liberation was not only seen as bad because people, wanted slaves or whatever, but also because the idea of a black person being on equal footing with you was seen as gross, disgusting, depraved, unnatural. You can see the same thing with trans liberation. People have these disgust reactions to seeing trans people in the world. They see it as not only, some sort of failing on a philosophical level, but they see it as disgusting. They see it as degenerate. All of these forms of oppression are predicated, firstly, they are built on top of and enforced via institutions which aim to combat depravity. The left, then, which should be, by its nature, the politics for depravity, has never accepted this role, and instead intends to become the boot, reprimanding the depraved within and without its ranks. And I'm not just talking about cancel culture here, fairly recent development. We're talking about throughout the entire history of leftism, from feminists getting kicked out of the International and so on. They do this for two main reasons. The first is populism and the second is moralism. So we'll address them in turn. If I had a fundamental critique of leftism, it would be this. The leftism is massively held back by its need for a popular working class revolution. The fact that the entire movement only works if you get the entire working class working on equal footing on the same basis towards one single goal, and this idea that leftists are just terrified of alienating the working class. They're so terrified of it. They're constantly talking about optics, infighting, and so on. You know, they can barely organize amongst themselves, let alone organize a popular working class movement. This focus entirely on collective power. Well, actually, we'll get back to that in a second. But leftists are terrified of emphasizing depravity too much for fear of alienating the working class. Well, let me tell you, the working class is already alienated and they're already depraved. Okay, if you focus too heavily on exclusively collective power, not to say the collective power doesn't have its place, it definitely does, but if you focus too heavily on only collective power at the expense of paying any attention to any other forms of power, then you're just going to be focusing entirely on what is most popular. You're just focusing entirely on the broadest possible demographic. You know what else focuses entirely on the broadest possible demographic? Marvel movies. Okay, I don't want Marvel socialism. I propose that a movement can only be as radical as it is popular. In other words, the two balance itself out. The more radical something is, the less popular it's going to be. We see it pretty much in every field in the world. Art being a good example. And as I just said, I don't want Marvel socialism, okay? The other side of this, aside from trying to appeal to the working class, is this moralism. I myself am a moral nihilist. I'm a moral nihilist, non-cognitivist, emotivist, if you really want to get down into the weeds. And I think most people in the modern world who aren't religious are some form of moral nihilists. They're maybe utilitarians or something like this. It's somewhat difficult to justify moral statements in the modern world, but people still make them all the time because they come from a place of emotional approval or disapproval. And relying on the left is definitely guilty, in my opinion, on relying too heavily on moralist concepts like justice and righteousness and exploitation and so on. I know leftists will argue that these all have roots in materialism, but when you really push them, they're just moral stances. This is Disney moralism. I don't want Disney moralism. I don't want Marvel socialism, okay? We're doing buzzwords here. I'm setting up buzzwords because that makes it catchy, you know? Let me ask you a question. If we want to talk about moralism, why are brands so into this idea of self-love? Why are corporations and capitalists and governments so into this idea of pushing self-love? You gotta have self-love, you gotta have self-respect, etc. Let me tell you, they're lying to you. They want to tell you, these corporations, they want it to Disney, you know, fucking these like, what are they called? Like toiletries corporations, Dove and shit, Johnson & Johnson, you know, they want to tell you, you're powerful, you're beautiful, right? They want to say this to you. They want to say, you're important, you're powerful, you're beautiful. Let me tell you, you're weak, you're pathetic, and you're ugly, just like the rest of us, okay? And to deny that is just gonna, if you premise your movement on fundamentally denying this, which is what leftists do, ignoring this fact that we are the depraved, you're gonna fail every single fucking time. Even if you do manage to overthrow some systems, you're gonna end up recreating the boot because you refuse to accept that we are all weak, pathetic, ugly, disgusting, depraved beings. You can't. It's hard to self-love when that's you, right? Brands hate it, leftists hate it even more. It's hard to self-love when you acknowledge this about yourself, but it's a fact. And in fact, I say it's a fact we should be doubling down on and saying, yes, this is the case that I make. One might even say it's the case for depravity. The other thing I want to talk about with regards to this, I just want to touch on this briefly, I don't want to go too off track here, is that this entire idea is actually antithetical to progress. You know, again, leftists, they call themselves progressives, in other words. And rightists call themselves conservatives. One side wants to conserve things as they were, one side wants to progress things forward. In other words, decelerationist and accelerationist. Although the words left and right have become completely disconnected from these sentiments. There are leftists who advocate for, you know, absurd policies like veganism, absurd decelerationist policies like veganism, and hippie shit like that, right? We don't fuck with any of that shit here on the No Thank You channel, because progress is immoral. Progress is immoral. When technology develops, it's amoral, but it does have a tendency towards the immoral. Our morality is shaped by the technology that we have, not the other way around. When you know, the first industrial and second industrial revolutions came around, these technologies made life worse for a lot of people. But they still happened. They still took place, even though I'm sure many of the people who developed these technologies may have even had moral qualms with them. You can see it. You think that like gene editing technology and hyper racism that comes with it, of a genetically engineered race of super beings, you know, oppressing the rest of us, you think that's going to wait? You think they're just going to not develop that? I mean, if you don't, someone else is, and then they're going to have an advantage in the market. You know, regardless of markets or not, if you say that's why we need a socialist revolution, well, you know, someone's going to do it eventually. I thought the whole point of socialism, as these fucking socialists keep saying, is, oh, the LED was invented in the Soviet fucking Union. Wow, look, the Soviets invented all of this great technology. And then because they didn't have markets, they never actually made any use of it. The LED was invented in the Soviet Union and they didn't fucking do anything with it for like 50 years. So this entire ideology, where you focus on moralism, on Disney moralism so hard, is anti-progress. Progress is often immoral. No one said evolution would be easy. Okay, now let's talk about the need for diversified societies. Diversification and decentralization are two policies I advocate for. Now I'm going to briefly, it says in all caps, briefly talk about the differences between decentralized and centralized systems from a broad perspective, because I can get way too fucking into this and I can talk about it for hours, so I want to go briefly. Centralized systems at small scale are extremely efficient and very good at doing long-term planning stuff. Even at large scales, they're better than decentralized systems at doing long-term stuff. So look at China, for example. China is able to pass these policies that are wildly unpopular and won't bear fruit until 10, 20 years down the line, which could never get passed in a Western democracy, and this gives them a competitive advantage against other countries. Okay, this is one thing that authoritarianism or centralized systems have an advantage on. They also work extremely well at small, sort of low, mid scale. So you can imagine a room full of 100 people. If you want those 100 people to do a task, you can imagine it's much more efficient to get started on that task if you just have one guy who tells everyone what to do. Hey, go build that bridge over there, rather than, and use these materials and these materials, you guys split off and do this, you guys, you know, and so on. Rather than those 100 people having to organize amongst themselves with no clear leader and directly democratically do this thing, it's going to take them a lot longer to get started. These are advantages that centralized systems have over decentralized systems. Hierarchical command and the ability to plan over the long term. These are two big advantages. The advantages that decentralized systems have, the main one is resilience. Decentralized systems are significantly more resilient from all sorts of problems versus centralized systems. You can see this in computer science, in computer networking. Imagine a direct download from a server compared to a torrent. If the server goes down, you can't download it. Whereas if one seeder goes down, you can still download your torrent. This is the case across all network systems. Decentralized networks are more resilient than centralized networks. They also are better at scale, at large scale. When you have a centralized system, a top-down pyramid hierarchy at a massive scale, it produces large inefficiencies because you require a middle management class in order to designate and delegate. Whereas these decentralized systems at scale, they take longer to get started. In the words of finance, to borrow a term from finance, they have higher initial startup costs, but once they get started, they are massively more efficient because people are capable of self-organization. These are two of the advantages and disadvantages. So now we need to determine what we really mean when we say decentralized networks, because some decentralized networks seem to be much more effective than others. Or in other words, there are some networks that claim to be decentralized but don't actually take advantage of the opportunities which decentralization offers them. And I argue that the key to identifying effective decentralized networks is diversity or diversification. In other words, diversity really is our strength because decentralization is resilience. In other words, diversity is our strength. I think that's a pretty funny thing to put in the video. The key to identifying truly decentralized networks is diversity. What I mean by that is, or in other words, you could even talk about it in terms of the diagonal method. The diagonal method claims that there have only ever really been two types of societies or organizations of societies tried. If you have a grid, okay, you have a grid. It says high connectivity, low integrate. On the one hand, God, I'm fucking this up. I was doing so well. On the one hand is connectivity. On the other hand is integration. You have a high a low integration, low connectivity society, you get fascism, isolationism, it's terrible for everyone involved. You have a high connectivity, high integration society, you get global neoliberal capitalism, it's bad for everyone involved, except a few at the top. I mean, both situations are bad for everyone except a few at the top. What has rarely been tried is a high connectivity, low integration society, which is what I propose is good decentralization. Because what that really means is, to put it in maybe leftist terms, would be solidarity without similarity. In other words, a diversified network. Again, to borrow some terminology and thought structures from computer science, computer networking, a decentralized network where every single node on that network runs the same architecture is pretty heavily vulnerable to attack, because the same attack works on every single node in that network. So it doesn't take much more effort to bring down the entire network than it does to bring down just one node in that network. Whereas a highly diversified network where each node has a very different architecture, but they also are still interconnected and intercommunicable, is much, much more resilient to attack. In other words, effective decentralized networks are diversified networks. To put this in terms of policy, we would be talking about panicism, i.e. the idea of many different political systems operating interconnectively but separately at all times. You could call it patchwork if you really wanted to. I think I kind of ran out of notes here. But we can apply this framework to a couple of real-world examples. Let's compare 3 different systems in technology here, so we can practice identifying effective decentralized systems. The first thing we'll talk about is YouTube. Hey, YouTube has high integration, okay? You can upload videos, you can upload YouTube shorts, you can live stream, you can do text posts, polls, follow people, subscribe, make accounts, comment, like, all of the things that these are lots and lots of different features, highly integrated features. But it's low connectivity. It fails the test. It is super low connectivity. YouTube does not integrate with things outside of its own ecosystem at all. Barely at all. It sucks at integrating with things outside of its own ecosystem. Therefore, YouTube is not a decentralized network or a decentralized system. I don't think that should be difficult. Everyone agrees. YouTube, not a decentralized system. Now let's talk about cryptocurrencies. They claim to be decentralized. Let's see how well they pass this test. Cryptocurrencies, fairly low integration, or sort of middling integration. They generally just be used for doing the one thing they do, like Bitcoin. But if you look at Ethereum, they integrate smart contracts and NFTs and others, which allow for NFTs and much broader integration. However, here's what I argue, is that these systems are actually very low connectivity. They are generally run, the chain is owned or run by a small group of people, a DAO, who have total control over the chain and can choose to fork if they ever want to, without any input from the actual decentralized user base. That alone is centralization. It is clearly not distributed amongst people. It is not integrated. There is not high levels of integration. In other words, democracy. There's not levels of, I used the wrong word. There's not high levels of interconnectivity, in other words, democracy, i.e. the individual users are not highly connected to the system itself. Only a small group of people are connected to the system itself. In other words, lacking in democracy. And the system doesn't connect well with other systems. Trading cryptocurrencies for other cryptocurrencies or things outside of crypto entirely is either slow or impossible. Therefore, cryptocurrency fails as an effective decentralized system. Let's talk about one more example. I think an extremely good example of a decentralized system, or which is RSS protocol. RSS passes the test with flying colors. Is it low integration? Yes, it is super low integration. It does one thing. It gives you an RSS feed. It takes XML documents, reads them, and then presents them to an RSS feed manager. That's all it does. It gives you a standard by which you can present information, and a standard by which your computer can understand that information, and then you get to decide how you display that information to you via any program you could possibly want. It's open source, it's free, etc. Super low integration. Perfect. It does one thing. Is it high interconnectivity? Yes, you can make an RSS feed for anything you could possibly dream of. Anything you can host on the internet and more, you can attach to an RSS feed. You could make an RSS feed for something that didn't even exist. If you really wanted to, you could do that. No one is stopping you. You can integrate RSS into, you can connect RSS into literally anything you could possibly desire. Therefore, RSS passes the test as an extremely good decentralized system or effective decentralized system. It is high connectivity, low integration. This is the sort of system that I propose we use more often in many different fields of life, including politics, including the way we organize people in society. Highly interconnected, lowly integrated, highly solidaritous, highly democratic, low integration, low uniformity, you could say. And this is where we run into another weird problem with leftism, which is the dualism between collectivism versus minority rights, collective unity versus minority rights. That the left has this policy on minority rights, which is a good thing, but also has a policy on collective unity, which just objectively these two things can't intermesh. Unless you have this solidarity without similarity principle, or this diagonal method, this principle of the diagonal method. You see these groups running into problems when they try to run as a high integration system. They try to uniformize themselves. They try to become one globule, or they have that attitude imposed upon them because people actually really want to do that in real life. Where various groups that the left advocates for are often at massive odds with each other internally. So as a sort of cliched example, take a religious minority group like Muslims versus LGBT people. Generally, these two groups have a lot of problems with each other. Not all Muslims, obviously many Muslims are perfectly comfortable with LGBT people, but there is definitely a subset of Muslims who are religiously opposed to the idea of LGBT rights. And I'm sure there are a certain sect of LGBT militant atheists who are opposed to, religion. There are groups that simply can't be integrated with each other in society. This is not a white supremacist ethno-state talking point. This is just a fact. And it's a fact that we need to take account for if we want liberation. Therefore, the key here would be to have these groups less integrated but more interconnected. I'm not saying we shun all the Muslims off into one tiny ethno-state. That would be fucking insane to even suggest. And shove all the gays into another ethno-state, right? This would be fucking insane. No one is advocating for this. Don't accuse me of it. I would never advocate for it. What I am proposing is a highly interconnected society. Okay, and we can bring it back. We can bring this back to, now that we've talked about this, we can bring this back to the thing that I was talking about originally, depravity. You have all of these groups with their various different depravities, okay? Various different degeneracies, moral abhorrences, and they leave each other alone, but they interconnect highly strongly. Okay, we're getting to it. This is the position that I advocate for. This is the case for depravity, is that if you actually embrace depravity, you automatically assume this position of solidarity without similarity, or whatever you want to call it, highly democratic, lowly uniform society. Because in order to actually indulge people's depravities, you have to, that necessarily negates uniformity. It necessarily, definitionally, tautologically opposes imposed uniformity. It brings with it the foregone conclusion of diversification. And in order to advocate for its own rights, it also necessarily brings with it the goal of solidarity, the goal of highly interconnected societies. There we go. We got to the bottom of it. Fucking one take Jake.